Our first reading this morning was from Dr. Seuss. Our second reading this morning comes from the story of the Exodus, chapter 16. This is taking place about 6 weeks after the Israelites have been brought by God out of slavery in Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us. It's against God." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked towards the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." And then, in the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when that layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." So stop me if I've told you this one before. A young man decides he wants to become a novice at a monastery, and he goes and meets with the head monk, and he says, "We would welcome you, but you need to know that we take a strict vow of silence here. In fact, every 10 years you get to say 2 words. That's it. Every 10 years you can pick 2 words, and that's all you get to say." And he's like, "I'm in. I would like to be part of you." And so he joins the monastery, becomes a novice. 10 years go by. He does everything he's asked to do. And when the day comes for him to get to speak, he goes to the head monk, and he says 2 words. He says, "Bed hard." You're remembering this one now, right? And then another 10 years goes by, and he does everything he's told to do. And he comes before the monk again at the end of the 10 years, the head monk, and he gets to say his 2 words, and he says, "Food bad." Then another 10 years goes by, he does all he's asked to do. The day comes, he goes before the head monk to say his 2 words, and he says, "I quit." And the head monk says, "You know, I'm not really surprised. You've been here for 30 years, and all you've done is complain, complain, complain." You know, every time I've heard this text talk about, I think the Israelites get a bad rap for all their complaining. And it says over and over again, they're complaining in the text. I want to lift complaining up today as a positive. All right? I want to say that maybe complaining is a gift. And I say that not only because I have that gift, but I know that some of you have that gift as well. Can I get an amen? Amen. All right. So I want us to really look at complaining today in a new light. See it in a new way. A wise man once said to me, and by the way, anytime in a sermon when I say a wise man said to me, I'm really talking about my father. I quoted him in a sermon a long time ago, and he came up to me afterwards and said, "You know, maybe it doesn't sound so good that you're quoting your own dad in the sermon. So just say, when you want to quote me, just say, 'A wise man once said to me.'" So a wise man once told me that true optimists are the people that complain all the time. That's not the pessimist. The optimist complains all the time. Why? Because the optimist sees the world as it could be and believes that it could be better than it is. So I claim both the moniker of optimist, and I'm one of the world's great complainers. I do not make it through the day without a few good complaints. And I know some of you are really good at that too. And so I want us to think today about complaining. And actually, I don't even want to talk about complaining as a positive thing. I want to lift it even higher. I want to suggest that we think today of whether it's actually possible that complaining could be a spiritual practice. And by that I mean a spiritual practice that complaining could be one of those things that draws us more deeply into relationship with God's Spirit and then sends us out into the world to serve in God's mission. Do you think it's possible that complaining could do that for you? Could draw you deeper into a connection with God's loving Spirit and send you out to serve in the world? And to sort of get us into this today, I have provided you with what I think is perhaps the greatest example of a complainer, if not in all of American literature, at least in children's literature, the Grinch. The Grinch is a great complainer. You all know the story. He lives on top of this mountain. He's above all these who's that live down below. And he can't stand all the noise that they make, particularly around Christmas time. He likes his quiet. And he has to hear all the noise they make, particularly on Christmas Day. They have all their noisemakers and their instruments, and the kids are all making noise and playing with all their toys. And they all stand in the circle in the village square, and they sing this song that he has to listen to, and he's tired of it. He's sick of hearing it and having to complain about it. And so he comes up with this amazing idea. Coulter, you know what the idea is, right? What's he going to do? He's going to steal Christmas. He figures out that if he goes down into the town disguised as Santa Claus, and he sneaks into all the houses, instead of leaving things, he's going to take things. Everything. In fact, he takes all the toys, all the decorations, all the food. He takes the Christmas trees, everything. He shoves them up the chimney. He puts them on top of a huge sled. And then he rides up to the top of the mountain where there's a big drop-off. And what's he going to do? Dump it. What's that? Well, yeah, the dog's in there too. I left the dog. How could I forget the dog of all? Max. Yeah, I forgot Max. And Seuss, when he was writing this book, Geisel, said that this is where he got stuck in the story. He didn't know where to go from there. He had the Grinch up about ready to dump everything. He said, I'd sort of created this big mess, and I didn't know how to get out of it. He said, I was afraid I would get into some kind of a preachy or moralizing ending to the story. Didn't know what to do. So he said, what I did, I just sat down and started drawing, and he drew this picture of the Grinch seated at the Christmas table with the Who's, eating the roast beast with them. And he thought, that's it. That's the end of the story, that somehow the Grinch ends up, beyond all his complaining and all these things he's done in the story, he ends up in community with the Who's. That's the end of the story. And how does he get the Grinch there? Well, you guys know what happens. The Grinch is about ready to dump it all. Christmas is over. And then he hears down in the village square the Who's standing around, holding hands like they always do on Christmas morning, singing that song, Welcome Christmas. And he suddenly realizes that all this stuff that he thought was what Christmas wasn't really Christmas. It was nice, but they didn't need it. They just needed each other. And we're told that that's when his heart grows 2 sizes bigger, and he races down the side of the mountain with all their stuff and returns it all, and he joins them in community. And I see an interesting pattern there, that the complaining leads to action, leads to deeper sense of community. Had he not done all that complaining and done something about it, he may still be up on top of that mountain all by himself. And Seuss says the origin of this story was one December 26th, the day after Christmas. He was looking into the mirror in the bathroom, and he saw a sort of Grinchy scowl on his face. And he realized he just didn't have the Christmas spirit. And he sort of saw the Grinch in the mirror and decided he needed to write a story to work his way through that. And that's how he came up with the Grinch. And his stepdaughter said that on his best days, Dr. Seuss was the Cat in the Hat. Sort of that carefree, wild character. On his worst days, he was the Grinch. And in fact, his license plate said Grinch on it. And I wonder if one of the reasons we love this story so much is that we can see ourselves in the Grinch. We've all been there. We've been the one that's grousing and complaining about everybody else. Can I get an amen? All right. So maybe that's why we love this story so much. And if you don't see yourself in that story, I hope you do see yourself in the story of this narrative from the Exodus today. These people who God has cared about enough to bring out of slavery in Egypt, where their lives were terrible, he leads them into the wilderness to something better, they're told. And now they've been wandering for 6 weeks. And first they ran out of water. God provided water. Then they got worried that they were lost. God provided this pillar of fire and smoke that went in front of them. It led the way. But now they're starving to death. They're hungry. And they're tired of waiting for something to happen. And they begin to imagine maybe it would have been better if we just stayed back in Egypt. At least we had food back there. They're not, of course, really remembering what it was like. It's only been 6 weeks. They've already forgotten. They're tired of waiting for God to provide. Can you imagine if God said, oh, by the way, it's not going to be 6 weeks. It's going to be 40 years you have to wait. I don't even like to wait 5 minutes in a line at the grocery store. And here they're going to have to wait 40 years to finally get to the promised land. And so they complain. They lift up their complaint to Moses and Aaron, but that's how they send the complaint to God, is through those emissaries. They're complaining to God. What did we do this for? Why did we follow you if we're just going to starve out here in the wilderness? And how does God respond? Well, I'll tell you this. God doesn't respond the way Pharaoh would have responded. Pharaoh didn't care about these people at all. The domination system doesn't listen to the cries of the meek and the lowly and the hungry and those in need of care, because then they don't have to do anything about it. If we don't know what you need, we don't have to do anything about it, says the domination system. But God hears them. And here's the real kicker of the story. God doesn't get angry with them. God doesn't, at this point in the story, God doesn't get angry with them. God doesn't chastise them. God doesn't punish them. God listens and responds. God hears their cry, listens, and responds. Which reminds me of the story of the guy who's so jealous of his next-door neighbor, John, because everything seems to work out for John and not for him. John's won the lottery. John just got a great new job. And so this guy is always praying to God, God, what's going on here? Why is John's life so much better than mine? He doesn't go to church. He doesn't pray. I pray to you all the time. I pray to you on Sunday morning. I pray to you on Sunday night. Every day I start praying to you. Every hour of the day I stop and pray to you about what I want. I pray constantly over and over. John never prays to you. Why does John get everything and I don't get anything? And then he hears this voice in his head that says, because, my friend, John doesn't bug me all the time. That story aside, maybe God is bugged by the Israelites in this passage, but you can't tell it from the narrative. God responds to them. Where Pharaoh would have said, I don't care about you people. I don't need to respond. God loves them, and God responds because of their complaint. In fact, the suggestion of the story is that rather than it pulling them apart, their complaining draws them more deeply into relationship with God, because they're saying, God, this is what we need from you. This is our struggle. These are our pains. These are our sorrows. This is what we need. And it allows God to listen, learn, and respond in a loving way. It deepens their relationship with each other. So what do you have to complain about today? And I only sort of mean that as a rhetorical question. What do you have to complain about today? What's at the top of your list of things you want to grumble and gripe and complain about? Because everybody's got a list. And some of you got some pretty heavy stuff at the top of that list. Some of you are dealing with personal struggles in your life. Some of you are dealing with addiction. Some of you are dealing with broken relationship. Some of you are dealing with money problems. Some of you are dealing with loneliness. Some of you are dealing with physical issues. Some of you are dealing with family members that are struggling with all of this, and you're feeling their pain too. What do you want to complain about today? And would you be willing to lift those complaints up to God without excuse, without trying to mitigate them in some way, or say, well, I really shouldn't say this to you, God, but would you be willing to lift a prayer of complaint to God about what you see in the world that needs to change? Because let me tell you, if you did that, you're in great company. Within our story of faith, you would be in great company. The Israelites were great complainers from they didn't even waste any time complaining. They started out from the beginning complaining. The prophets complain all the time about injustices they see and how the people aren't responding and how they need God to do something about it. We have the entire book of Job, which is really about a very righteous man, maybe the most righteous man that ever lived, whose life is going terribly. Everything's going wrong for him, and he doesn't understand why, because he tries to be a good person. And he complains to God. And God doesn't chastise him for doing it. God gets in a conversation with him about it. They come to a deeper understanding of each other through that story. And Jesus, great complainer. He complains about the disciples. He complains about people that say one thing and do another. He complains about the leadership of his people. He complains about the empire. You might even say sometimes he complains about God. So would you be willing to take up complaining as a spiritual practice? With a caveat, of course. Complaining as a spiritual practice isn't just complaining for the sake of complaining. It isn't complaining about the same stuff over and over again and never doing anything about it. It isn't complaining that's just self-serving. It's complaining for the sake of the world. Complaining for the sake of what you see is wrong and needs to change. And it's complaining like the way the Israelites complained. It doesn't say, this guy had this complaint, this guy had this complaint against God. It's they have one complaint they lift up together. We're hungry, we need to be fed. It's complaint that comes together that draws us into community with each other and God. So maybe the question is, what complaint as a church family do we want to lift up? Where do we see injustice in the world that we say together we could lift up this complaint, make people aware of it, and then the next part of that is then respond to it. Because spiritual practices are meant not only to draw us inward towards God, but also outward into action. What is the communal complaint or complaints we might lift up as a church family? Where do we see injustice? Would we be willing to lift those up together, allow them to center us more deeply in God's love, and then act on those complaints? I just invite you to think about that this week. Think about the story of the Grinch as his complaints lead him into deeper community and action. Think about the story of the Israelites, how their complaints lead them into a deeper connection with God's love and justice, and lead them to continue this journey into the wilderness, hopefully to be what God asked them to be, a light to the world. And if you're out there this week complaining to people, and somebody says, why do you got to complain all the time? Can't you look on the bright side of things? Say to them, well, I'm not really complaining. I'm praying to God. And I'm imagining with God how the world could be. Let's bow our heads and pray together. God, your creation is so abundant. There's so much there to provide for us. And yet there's so much need in the world, and sometimes we can't figure that out. There's so much wrong with the world, we don't even know where to begin with our list of complaints sometimes. But help us to trust enough in you to lift those complaints, to know that you will hear them. You will respond through our hearts, and you will lead us into action, into justice, into love. And all God's people say, Amen.